Former Egyptian President Mubarak is to be released after nearly 6 years in detention. What political fallout can we expect from that? And the European Court of Justice made two seemingly contradictory rulings in the same week regarding religious headscarves in the workplace. What's the difference behind these verdicts? Welcome to The Point. I'm Lishin. Former President of Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, is to be released from detention at a military hospital in Cairo. Mubarak served as the fourth president of Egypt for almost 3 decades, from 1981 until February 2011, before he stepped down after 18 days of demonstrations during the Egyptian Revolution. He was then sentenced to life in prison after being convicted in 2012 of ordering the shooting of protesters, but the case was retried twice. In 2014, he was given a 3-year prison sentence owing to the embezzlement of public funds. So how do Egyptians feel about his release, and is Egyptian society still sharply divided after the coup which toppled the freely elected government of Mohamed Morsi and the subsequent rise to power of General El-Sisi? I'm joined from Amman by Dr. Florence Eid Oakden, CEO and Chief Economist of Arabia Monitor, a leading independent research firm from London, and from Cairo by Bashir Abdel Fattah, editor-in-chief of Al Ahram newspaper, the most widely circulated daily in Egypt. But before we start the discussion, let's first take a look at what do the Egyptians say about the former president and his release.
We were all very upset. I can't imagine that anyone would be happy. I feel that the revolution was useless.
Seriously, this is surreal. Who killed those protesters then? Who ordered this to happen? If everyone is innocent, is it we the people who've killed ourselves? That's not logical.
Yes, he did some things wrong, but it's enough for me that this man has not shed the blood of a single Egyptian. It's enough that he managed to protect our country. For disregard all opinions people say. Justice has said its opinion.
Things against Mubarak got bigger than they should. He didn't do the crimes that deserve all this, but it's God's wisdom. History will show that there's a message for us. For a man at his age and in his medical condition to live that long until he is proven innocent, this is a great sign from God.
Let's start our conversation. Bashir Abdel Fattah, how do you comment on Mubarak's final release? Is this result regarded as fair by the Egyptian people?
First of all, I'd like to thank you for having me in your program, and I'd like to say greetings to your guests and your audience everywhere.
Thank you.
I'd like to say that Mubarak release was expected so much from many Egyptians because Mubarak was tried in front of the normal judiciary system, not military or exceptional judiciary system, and this is a very important point. And the judiciary system in Egypt depends on documents and evidences. And the trial of Mubarak was suffering from the lack of evidences and the documents. So it expected that he will be released. Most of the Egyptians think now that Mubarak was a good ruler to the country, although he stayed or he remained on office more than 30 years, and he failed to cross with the country towards development and stability and democracy. But when people make comparison between the Mubarak era and the recent circumstances, they discover that the pre-revolution era before 2011 was better than now. There are many reasons for that, but in general and finally, most of the Egyptians think that to remain during the Mubarak era is much better than the revolution and the disintegration of the country and the consequences of the revolutions and what happened. So most of the Egyptians look to Mubarak now as a hero. We know his military background. He was one of the heroes of the October 1973 war against Israel. But politically, Mubarak has his mistakes, his faults, but in general, because he is now an old man and he was jailed for more than 3 years, most of the Egyptians make some sort of sympathy with him after this period.
Yeah, Dr. Eid Ogden, what is your reaction on this? And secondly, will his release make any difference to today's political scene in Egypt, given that also many members of the current government were with him while he was in power?
I think it's important to regard this event as the passing of an era. Mr. Mubarak was appropriate for the era during which he ruled. He guarded stability and did his best to promote economic development. But across the Arab world, this was a battle between political and security stability and economic development and economic opportunity and advancement for the average citizen. And I'm afraid that not just in Egypt, but across the Arab world, including in countries that have not undergone revolutions and regime change over the past 6-7 years, the battle against economic advancement, or the lack thereof, is the one that won. It won against the battle for security. Therefore, those who gave priority to security over economic opportunity for citizens were imperiled, and those who were not removed are now rushing in order to make a difference to the provision of economic opportunity for the average citizen. So the departure of Mr. Mubarak was part of that era, that is a bygone era. And therefore, the trial will not impact very much, or the outcome of the trial at this stage, A, because it took so long before this result came about, since 2011, B, because there's widespread recognition that the challenges were formidable. Yes. And that really even those countries that didn't undergo revolution didn't necessarily succeed in resolving them. And C, because the challenges are still there and there is focus on the challenges rather than focus on the past.
Right. Mr. Abdel Fattah, let me ask you this. Mohamed Morsi, the president after Hosni Mubarak was hailed as the first democratically elected head of state in the Egyptian history of 5,000 years. However, by the military led by General al-Sisi and later sentenced to death. So what does this say about imposing a Western-style democracy in a Muslim-majority republic in the Middle East?
I would like to say that the release, removing of Mohamed Morsi related to many reasons. First of all, Muslim Brotherhood was not ready and able to lead the country politically. They have a majority in the elections, and also they can win all the elections that the Egyptian country has organized after the revolution of 2011. But this not means that Muslim Brotherhood has political leaders, political actors. That's why many of the Egyptians begin to reconsider voting for Muslim Brotherhood. In addition to that, we cannot ignore the existence of Muslim Brotherhood and all the Islamic movement in Egypt, whatever they were, Salafist or Muslim Brotherhood or any other wing of the Islamic movement. We cannot ignore this existence. So it is silly that you try to, for example, eliminate them from the Egyptian society. We cannot do that. We want them to reconsider their ideas. They have to confess their mistakes, make some sort of self-criticism in order to resume their role in the political arena. Yes. They have to separate between using Islam as a religion and political ideas, for example.
Yes.
So in the future, I think one way or another, there will be a political reconciliation between the military and the Egyptian society as a whole, and Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamic movements in general.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Yes, thank you, Mr. Abdel Fattah. I have to leave it there. But last question to Upton. What do you say about this question that by imposing a Western-style democracy in a country like Egypt, do you think it really succeeded in bringing about the changes it claimed it was trying to do?
I wouldn't agree with the proposition that a Western-style democracy was being imposed on Egypt. I think there was a genuine uprising from the Egyptian people against a regime that, as I've said, belongs to the past because it wasn't delivering the goods. Across the Arab world, we've seen this. Whether the leader was deposed or not, we've seen uprisings. It is inevitable that with progress and information exchange, economic development would take the upper hand, and also inevitable that once you have economic development, a push for democracy would emerge again in all of these countries. Now, what the democratic system looks like and the pace of democracy, the pace of transition, all of that needs to be locally, indigenously determined by the peoples of the various countries, and certainly not imposed from abroad. That I agree with. But I do think that what happened in Egypt was Egyptian. It was well deserved that the people moved and expressed their voice after years of the lack thereof. And transitions are difficult. They take a long time. So I wouldn't necessarily condemn where we are today, neither in economic performance nor in the system that is reigning politically, as a failure in Egypt. It's part of the transition.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Eid.
In Latin America, these transitions took decades.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. Yes, we get your point.
20 and 30 years.
Thank you. We get your point.
My pleasure.
Yeah. So you have been watching The Point, and here's my point on this question. I do not necessarily agree totally with our guests, but here's what I think on this issue. I think the main problem under Mubarak's rule was the level of corruption that was rampant throughout the country. Now, Egyptians who wanted to get rid of that problem probably understood that one person, one vote democratic system is not a general panacea for a country's ill. You need to improve your governance in order to earn the public's trust, not necessarily by changing the system. The system has to fit the country itself. That's how I see it. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back right after this short break for another topic. Stay with us. On Tuesday, the EU's top court, the European Court of Justice, ruled that a Belgian firm was within its rights to dismiss a female employee who wore an Islamic headscarf to work. The ruling finds that the head covering was against the company's consistent and general rules on appearance in a public-facing role. What's interesting is another case that the court ruled almost at the same time, involving a Muslim employee in France. The employee won the case against her employer, who dismissed her for wearing a religious headscarf. So what's the difference between these two rulings? I'm joined today from Brussels by Mr. Peter Klepper, head of the Brussels office of Open Europe, a think tank and campaign group, and from Coventry, UK, Dr. Ben Margulies. Mr. Klepper, let me come to you first. What do you think are the differences between these two rulings? Are they contradictory with each other? Do you agree with the verdicts?
Well, contradictory. The first ruling involves a company that had a regulation, an internal regulation banning political and religious symbols, like, for example, headscarves, but also this goes further than that. Also, all kinds of other symbols would be banned. Now, of that, the ECJ has said it is perfectly fine if a company imposes such a ban. The other ruling concerns the case where a customer had complained that some of the employees was wearing a headscarf. And in this case, the ECJ has said this is not objective, this is subjective, and this should not be possible. Now, as you can see, this is all quite arbitrary. What is subjective, what is objective? I think fundamentally it's a good idea that the ECJ has expressed some common sense that companies can, of course, have certain guidelines for their employees, but I think it will always be up for debate whether you know, we're talking about a subjective or an objective element.
Dr. Ben Margulies, what do you think of the two verdicts? In the Belgian case, as we just heard, the company was given the right to impose consistent and general rules to make the workplace religiously neutral. But in the French case, the company, which does not have such explicit policy, cannot dismiss an employee for wearing headscarves.
Yes, it seems to be, it's consistent in the sense that I think the ECJ is saying that if you're going to have a ban on these sorts of overt religious or political symbols, it has to be a pre-existing and neutral ban. And what they're emphasizing, what seems to be the difference, is that they can't simply impose or concoct a ban because a customer has expressed a prejudice. It has to be it gives the impression that it has to be something that the company has rationally decided on for rational business reasons beforehand. Now, you could argue that there's an ambiguity that a company could say, well, our customers don't like Muslim headscarves, so we're going to ban religious symbols, and then, someone could go to the European Court of Justice and claim, use these two rulings against each other. Yes, there's a neutral policy, but they only enacted it because of customers' prejudice, and that could bring the two rulings into conflict. But on its face, they're not really contradictory. It's a question of whether it's a pre-existing and consistent policy, and a question of the motivation behind it. For the moment now, it's not contradictory. I could see how they could come into conflict later.
Yeah, Mr. Peter Klepp, some people are interpreting the rulings as a sign that the EU's highest court is giving a blanket ban on religious symbols or wearing religious symbols in the workplace. What do you think is the message that the court is trying to give behind these two rulings, or really is not trying to give any a coherent message at all, that is quite, divided in itself about where to go on this very sensitive issue?
Of course, this is not a European ban on headscarf or something. That's quite ridiculous. We're talking about a ruling which allows companies to freely choose what kind of rules apply in the company. Now, more fundamentally, a lot of this discrimination legislation is indeed quite arbitrary. You have to deal with all kind of subjective value judgment. And I think part of the problem is that people confuse by not liking a certain attitude. You can perfectly argue that it's not very moral for a company to have a certain ban on religious symbols, for example. But then another question is, even if you think this is a bit nasty, this is immoral, should it be illegal? And in a free society, these things, companies behaving in what can be perceived a nasty way by some people, is still perfectly legal, because we don't want policymakers to have their say on what is moral and what is not moral. The cornerstone of a free society is that property rights are being applied, and this is not the state forcing companies to have a headscarf ban or not. It is about allowing companies the freedom to decide their own internal guidelines.
Now, I'm just told that we are joined from Washington, D.C. by Zeyneb Aly, who is co-founder and executive director of American Islamic Congress. Zeyneb, thank you for joining us. Now, a lot of people are saying that many non-Muslims, especially non-Muslims, are saying that the reason why women wear headscarves is because they have been coerced by their male society into doing so. What is your reaction, and how do you look at the two verdicts?
I disagree with that opinion. I think Muslim women headscarf is one of the oldest traditions in the Muslim or in the Islamic religion, and women follow it just like any other religions, just like we have it in the Christianity, the nuns wear it, and in Judaism, some of the sects of Judaism, and many other religions, that it's for modesty. And people are free, and if they want to follow that, or if they don't. Some countries, they put orders, like there are executive orders, or there are the rules and law of the country that they force women to wear it, such as in Iran and Saudi Arabia. But many other countries and individuals are free, and they have the will if they want to put it on or take it off.
I figure you must have been following the case where the European Court of Justice have just given out its ruling. What do you think of the two rulings?
I think it's very interesting at this period of time. I think it comes in a critical time after the new president took place, and it is there is a lot of back and forth in that, and the community, also the Muslim community, they have a mixed feelings about it, especially with the changing of ruling here and there.
Dr. Ben Margulies, let me come to you. In some European countries, as we have said, like in France and Belgium and Austria, there are already bans on full-face veils in public places. Last December, German Chancellor Angela Merkel said wearing the full-faced veils should be banned wherever it is legally possible. Austria is also considering a general ban on state employees wearing the headscarves and other religious symbols. What's the future trend across Europe in that? Are we seeing a more restrictive trend on wearing these religious symbols? And also, let's not forget that we're mostly focusing on the Muslim headscarves. If you're wearing a cross, the chances are people will not see it.
No, it's definitely, there's certainly a trend in European politics, especially among kind of the right-wing populists like Geert Wilders, to attack or attempt to suppress openly Islamic clothing, nominally in defense of liberal values of secularism or the proper role of religion in public places, because Islam is seen to challenge the normal church-state balance. Usually what that really is a cover for a much more exclusionary form of nationalism. It's a way of signaling Muslims aren't fully part of the nation. It's a way of policing Muslims. It's a way of signifying that Muslims are backward or need to be controlled. There's the claims about secularism are sometimes ring somewhat false. As for whether there's a trend, that depends on certain national context, whether countries have a history of really policing church-state interaction, like in France or Germany. There's a custom behind this. Whether how strong populist movements are in given countries, whether there are live conflicts between Muslims and non-Muslims. It really depends on political context. For example, in Britain, where you also have this kind of Islamophobia, there are certainly lots of people who are worried or frightened of Islam and don't think it's British, but there's not a history of policing what people wear, so you wouldn't really expect headscarf bans to a large degree here. You are correct that they do tend to target Muslims more because Muslims are more visible. There was a famous case in Britain regarding a British Airways employee who did wear a cross.
Mr. Klepper, what do you think of this subject? Do you think there's a trend toward more control, more restriction on the Muslim symbols, especially headscarves worn by women across Europe, or is it just really singled out incidents?
Well, even if there would be, and I doubt if there is, this ruling is actually going the other way. This ruling is not imposing anything on anyone. It is only preventing that the state imposes on companies to have less freedom to have a certain dress code. A company can, according to this ruling, also impose rules. People cannot wear a Donald Trump t-shirt at work. And this strikes me as perfectly sensible. So that's all what the ruling is doing. Of course, apart from that, there are a lot of examples to be given of countries that have tried to impose headscarves bans or burqa bans in one way or another. But that's another debate. It's in itself completely unrelated to this, and this particular ruling is the freedom of companies and is not imposing anything on anyone.
Finally, Zeyneb Aly, what do you think of the potential trend towards increasing restrictions on religious symbols which affect Muslim women the most? And how can further tensions between the Muslim community and other communities be prevented in your eyes?
Well, it is very important to look into this as from a religious freedom perspective, especially in this country here and many other countries, especially in the Western world, given that freedom of practicing religion is permitted by the Constitution and the law. And a lot of women, Muslim women actually, they are concerned about how the situation is going to be towards women, and men and women on the same, but women more, especially if they are wearing a headscarf. So this is a situation that we are addressing as the American Islamic Congress with many human rights organizations, and there is that concern, and you see it and you feel it, especially in the rise of hate crimes that we see spreading now in the community or in the country. And these signs are actually much more than what, even after 9/11 and what we have seen in terms of reaction. Things have changed in a very different direction, and the headscarf issue still. People between believing that it's going to be there will be a distinction between women who are wearing a headscarf and not, and they are afraid of being discriminated against of that.
Many thanks, Zeyneb. But we have to leave it there. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us today, our guests from Europe, America. And that's it for this edition of The Point. And here, very quickly, is my last point. It's a complicated issue, I know, but when I visit a country as a guest, I always try to respect the local rules. I will try not to disturb people's lives, even though I want to hold on to my own way of life as much as possible. So it's a question of give and take. Of course, there are people who are racist and discriminate against outsiders, but I find that when I take care of my relationship with my surroundings, almost always I'm met with mutual respect. That's it for this edition of The Point. See you tomorrow. See you next Monday at the same time.